Hi there, my name's Mark and I'm one of the members here at St James Church Yeovil. This morning I'd like to continue our teaching series on the very good book by looking at the Old Testament prophet Hosea. The book of Hosea is a prophecy directed towards the unfaithful nation of Israel, but it's presented using the love story between Hosea and his unfaithful wife as a metaphor. Rudyard Kipling once said that if history was taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. So if you like a good story, if you like the Game of Thrones series, then this book will be right up your street, as it's pretty racy in parts. There are parts of it that read a bit like a domestic, where not a single elephant in the room is left safe. So before I launch into the story, I'd like to just give a bit of context to it. The prophecy was brought during the 8th century BC to the kingdom of Israel. Israel had been a divided kingdom for several years, and the prophecy was given to the northern half, which was called Israel, or sometimes Ephraim, and it was led by King Jeroboam II. Israel was the most prosperous it had probably ever had been at this point, but as we meet it, it was starting to crumble a bit. It was a bit fragile, it was materialistically arrogant, and there was lots of corruption, injustice, and lots of exploitation of the poor. Another issue for Israel at this point was the issue of worship. You see, Israel were instructed to be faithful to God in their worship, and worship only in his temple, but the problem was that the temple was in the southern kingdom of Judah, in the capital, Jerusalem, so the people couldn't go across the border to their enemies to worship God, so they just worshipped him in traditional worship places where the Canaanites had in the past had set up their places of worship. So there was a lot of mixing with that ancient cultic religion, so worshipping of golden calves, golden statues was quite prevalent. There was shrine prostitution going on, and in some cases even child sacrifice. So things were a bit of a mess in the northern kingdom of Israel when it came to their relationship with God. So at this point, I want to just mention a few things. So firstly, I want us to remember that the way this book talks about women is not trying to suggest that God thinks this way of women or that we should, but it's a specific metaphor, this unfaithful wife. It's a specific metaphor of God trying to convey something very specific. It's not a general statement about women. The second thing is there's a form that repeats itself in this prophecy and also the other books called the Minor Prophets. And it goes a bit like this. You've got the indictment, where God raises the charge against the people who have gone the wrong way. And then you get the judgment. And this is where the consequences of their choices are spelled out to them. As somebody else put it, like fruit, the consequences grow out of the deeds themselves. So out of the things that they've done wrong, the judgment is the consequences, the things that are going to happen to them. And then you get the salvation, where God does not leave the people where they are in their sin or in the consequences of their sin, but he rescues them, he restores them, and heals them. And that is what God's forgiveness looks like. So on with our story. It begins in chapter 1 with Hosea marrying a woman who is going to be unfaithful with him, to him. In chapter 3, verse 1, it reads like this. The Lord said to me, Go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love sacred raisin cakes. Now, okay, I just want to say, God doesn't have a thing about raisins. What it was having raisin cakes was part of a ritualistic Canaanite sacrifice to their gods. It would be a bit like communion, bread and wine, but with a pagan deity. So it was a sign that they were worshipping in the wrong way to the wrong gods. Okay, the story goes on in chapter 4, verse 1 to 3. It says, "Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land dries up, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, and the fish in the sea are swept away." So there's a real ecological impact of this unfaithfulness. So as the story unfolds, Hosea's wife going after other men and selling herself and enjoying the riches that money buys her, it has an impact on their relationship and their marriage, and it's mirrored in the statements against the people. So in chapter 6 verse 3, it begins by God saying, "Return to me," and the prophet goes on to say, "Come, let us return to the Lord." And in verse 3 it says, "Let us acknowledge the Lord, let us press on to acknowledge him. As surely as the sun rises, he will appear. He will come to us like the winter rains, like the spring rains that water the earth." And the story mirrors that. Hosea tries to persuade his wife to come back to him, and she won't experience the exploitation of the other men who have lied and not given her the things that they said they would, and that he would begin providing for her again, and she wouldn't need to go off in prostitution anymore. In chapter 11, verses 1 to 4, the metaphor, it switches up a bit here, and God is seen as a parent to a rebellious child. But again, there's a real intimacy in this parenting love that's spoken of. It goes like this, verses 1 to 4. "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them up by the arms, but they did not realize. It was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. To them I was like the one who lifts up a little child to the cheek. I bent down low to feed them." And the story finishes up with his wife returning to him, and in chapter 14, the final chapter, verses 1 to 7, it goes like this. "Return, Israel, to the Lord your God. Your sins have been your downfall. Take words with you and return to the Lord. Say to him, forgive all our sins and receive us graciously, that we may offer the fruit of our lips. Assyria cannot save us. We will not mount war horses. We will never again say, our gods, to what our own hands have made. For in you the fatherless have compassion. I will heal their waywardness and love them freely. For my anger has turned away from them. I will be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like a lily. Like a cedar of Lebanon, he will send down his roots. His young shoots will grow. His splendor will be like an olive tree. His fragrance like the cedar of Lebanon. People will dwell again in his shade. They will flourish like the grain. They will blossom like the vine. Israel's fame will be like the wine of Lebanon. So why did I choose this perhaps strange book to talk about? Well, for a few reasons really. Firstly, there's a real intimacy with this story which permeates the whole book. God doesn't shy away from addressing any of the issues. The language is passionate, explicit, but it's gritty, earthy, and very real. God is not so distant in this story, but he's like a lover or a parent. God really cares for his people, and he wants their love in return. God really wants the best for us, and he doesn't want marginalized people or the earth to suffer because of our choices. God doesn't want to be distant. He came to earth as Jesus and got stuck in to the messiness of life. So let's let him into the messiness of our own lives. Another key theme in the book of Hosea is wisdom for living well. Although Israel was comfortable enough and it was fairly prosperous, politically things were becoming more ambiguous and volatile. Its leaders showed a real ineptitude for international relations, and what it would do would form alliances with some nations, and then it would break their word, playing one off against another. After King Jeroboam had died, they had a quick succession of leadership. 6 kings, 4 of whom were assassinated. There was a real lack of wise, godly leadership in the nation, and the people were starting to be pushed around by other powerful nations around them. Now, it wasn't that those relationships, those international relations were wrong per se, but it was trusting them to the exclusion of God, which is seen as a betrayal and unfaithfulness to God. When I think politically nowadays, Brexit, how the vaccines are shared out internationally, race, global race issues, gender, sexual rights, inequalities, those sorts of issues, I don't always know how to react. How do I know what the right thing to do is? It's really easy, I find, just to sit on social media, to become an armchair critic, to like some things, dislike them, retweet things, comment on things, but generally getting more and more uptight and angry. We have limitless information nowadays, but not always a lot of wisdom floating around. As in the time of Hosea, I feel a real need for deep godly wisdom on how to live and how to engage in the political, in the real issues of life. I love that verse which talks about pressing on to know God, to acknowledge God, to see him in the things around us. I would love to know his thoughts on matters of justice and inequality. And my need for God is as real as the people's need back in Hosea's time. So it's easy to be critical of Israel from a distance, using language like their prostitution of worshipping idols and false gods. But those things predominantly were, to do with gods of the land and fertility. It was essentially to do with how you would acquire wealth and security, which actually isn't so different from us today. God was saying, find those things in me. Don't go running after them as a means to an end. Don't go making those things your gods. And don't ever exploit people to gain those things. But find them, the security, your wealth, your comfort, in me. So I know this book has got some archaic language and some really strange cultural practices. I know the language can be explicit and maybe a bit raunchy in times. But I can't help feeling that the people in those days, the issues then, are not so different from us today. The stories, perhaps similar. The issues, similar. So there we have it. A love story, a dysfunctional family, political confusion, and yet a God who is so passionately in love with his people, so definitely committed to them, that he just can't help himself but to remain faithful to restoring them and committed to their well-being. So that's the book of Hosea from my point of view. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.